They expected the worst. The cold snap of boots, the hard slap of orders, the smell of fear soaked into wool and hair. They had been taught to believe the enemy was a monster. They had been told surrender meant shame, and shame meant punishment. In the dawn-grey light, a line of women shuffled forward, hands trembling, eyes glued to the dirt, each heart a small, furious drum. Behind them, the camp breathed. A low barbed wire hum, a distant guard tower, a single dog's bark swallowed by fog. Then the British soldiers stepped out of the shadows, not with rifles raised, but with faces that looked tired and human. A boot gently set down a loaf, a gloved hand offered a blanket. A soldier's voice, quiet, impossibly soft, said, "You're safe now." For a moment the world stopped obeying the maps they'd been given. Tears pooled like rain in empty bowls. No one expected mercy. No one was ready for the way it would undo them. The war had been burning for 6 years, and by early 1945, the Western Front had become a graveyard of collapsed hopes. Germany was retreating on almost every line. Cities lay in ruins, food was scarce, and entire divisions had dissolved into wandering clusters of exhausted soldiers. For most German women serving in auxiliary roles, clerks, medics, drivers, radio operators, the collapse came faster than they could understand. One day they were following precise instructions under the sharp discipline of the Wehrmacht. The next, they were fleeing through forests, hiding behind abandoned farmhouses, or marching with whatever retreating unit they could find before the front closed behind them. Many of these women had grown up hearing a single, relentless message: the Allies would show no mercy. British soldiers, they were told, were brutal. They would torture, humiliate, and destroy anyone wearing a German uniform, especially women. Fear was not just an emotion, it was a weapon that kept them obedient. And so, when they were finally captured, the fear reached its breaking point. The group in this story, 34 German women in their 20s and early 30s, had been part of a scattered signals unit operating near the Rhine. Their convoy had broken apart under the pressure of Allied artillery. What remained of their group walked for 3 nights through mud and shattered orchards until the British found them near a barn on the outskirts of a ruined village. They were cold, underfed, and shaking uncontrollably. Not from weather alone, but from anticipation of what they believed was coming next. British soldiers, too, carried their own exhaustion. These men had crossed through towns where civilians begged for bread. They had lost friends on frozen roads and in hedgerows thick with mines. Their uniforms were damp, their gloves worn thin, and their voices carried the weight of too many dawn patrols. They were not emotionless machines, they were tired humans who longed for the war to simply stop. But the British Army also carried something else: procedures. Protocol, a strict adherence to the Geneva Convention. It wasn't perfect, and not every unit followed it equally, but the principle was clear: prisoners of war, no matter the uniform, were to be treated with dignity. And when the patrol led by Sergeant William Hartley encountered the group of trembling German women, something shifted. The men recognized fear immediately, not the defiant, angry fear of captured soldiers, but a deeper kind, the kind carried by civilians forced into uniforms that did not protect them. The British formed a perimeter, rifles low, but ready. The women froze. Some lifted their hands, others simply sank to their knees, shoulders collapsing as though gravity had doubled its weight. One whispered, "Bitte nicht schlagen. Please don't beat us." Her voice cracked like thin ice. Hartley, whose father had been a schoolteacher and who still carried a gentleness beneath the layers of war, stepped forward. He had seen the rumours, the propaganda posters left behind in German towns, showing British soldiers as grinning wolves. It made him feel ill every time. He knew these women expected cruelty, and he knew that expectation alone could break a person long before a rifle ever did. "Stand up," he said, not harshly but firmly, as if addressing frightened civilians rather than prisoners. "No one's going to hurt you." But they didn't believe him. Why would they? Every story they'd ever been told warned them that kindness from the enemy was only a trick before the pain began. The British began escorting them toward a temporary holding camp, a cluster of tents and a mobile field station set up beyond the village. The women walked in silence, heads lowered. Any time a soldier stepped too close, someone flinched so violently it startled the entire group. A few whispered to each other, praying that whatever happened next would at least be quick. When they reached the camp, however, nothing matched the horrors they had pictured. There were no chains, no fists waiting behind canvas walls. Instead, the first thing the British did was offer water, real, clean water, poured into dented metal cups. One woman stared at the steam rising from a pot of tea as if it was a hallucination. Another covered her face and cried quietly, unable to understand why she was being given warmth instead of punishment. Behind them, a young British medic, Private Lawrence Cole, watched with a knot in his throat. His sister back in London was the same age as some of the prisoners. He knew the war had twisted the world into strange shapes, but this moment, seeing the shock on these women's faces at something as small as a blanket being placed over their shoulders, cut through the numbness he'd built up. These women had expected torture. Instead, they were met with procedures, professionalism, and above all, humanity. Every step of what happened next would challenge everything they believed about enemies and everything the British believed about themselves. The temporary holding camp sat on the edge of a ruined orchard, its branches black and twisted like the fingers of a burnt hand. Canvas tents snapped in the wind, their ropes humming with the tension of early spring storms. To the newly captured German women, the place looked more like a staging ground for punishment than a sanctuary. They expected interrogation, shouting, humiliation, things they'd been told were guaranteed once the British got hold of them. But instead of being separated or forced to kneel in the mud, the women were guided carefully into a tent warmed by a small iron stove. The heat made their eyes sting, partly from relief, partly from the overwhelming sense that they didn't deserve it. Their boots left trails of melted snow on the ground. One woman tried to stop the drip from her coat, whispering apologies to no one in particular, as though the puddle itself might anger a guard. Private Lawrence Cole watched the group settle, his medical satchel hanging at his side. He had expected hardened prisoners, maybe even defiant ones. Instead, he saw women barely holding themselves upright, one clutching a broken button on her tunic, another trying to hide a deep bruise on her wrist. Cole glanced at Sergeant Hartley, who gave a small nod and stepped outside to brief command. Inside the tent, the silence was suffocating. British medics moved slowly, deliberately, like men trying not to frighten skittish animals. The women recoiled at every minor movement, hands flinching, shoulders tightening, eyes darting like trapped birds. When a medic set down a tin container of warm broth, one of the women burst into tears. Not loud sobs, just a quiet shaking that travelled through the entire bench. She covered her mouth, ashamed of the sound escaping her. Another woman grabbed her hand, whispering something in German. Comforting, but trembling just as much. The British had seen destruction, starvation, and trauma before. But this particular kind of fear felt different. It wasn't born from immediate danger. It was inherited, taught, drilled into them through propaganda designed to keep them loyal to a dying regime. Most men in the British regiment didn't speak German, but certain emotions didn't require translation. When the medics asked if anyone was injured, the women didn't respond, not out of stubbornness, out of fear that admitting weakness might lead to punishment. Finally, one woman, thin as a shadow and missing 2 buttons from her blouse, lifted her sleeve. The bruise on her arm was deep and dark, a clear fingerprint pattern. It wasn't from the British, it was older. A medic's eyes tightened. He didn't ask who had done it. War already answered too many questions before words could. When he reached out with a bandage, she recoiled. He froze, hand mid-air. "I won't hurt you," he said, softly, the kind of voice a brother might use with a frightened sibling. She stared at him, disbelieving. She had been told British hands only brought pain, but this hand was steady, open, waiting. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, she extended her arm. The bandage wrapped around her skin like a quiet act of rebellion against everything she'd been taught. Outside the tent, the camp buzzed with the routine of war. Trucks rattling over frozen mud, officers shouting orders, the distant thud of artillery echoing from miles away. Yet inside the tent, a strange calm settled. Sergeant Hartley returned with instructions. These women are to be protected, fed, documented, treated according to regulation. It wasn't surprising. This was the British Army, after all. But to the women, those words shattered the last remnants of the monstrous image painted by German propaganda. Later that afternoon, a snowmelt wind swept through the camp, carrying the smell of wet earth and wood smoke. The women were given blankets. Real wool blankets, not the threadbare substitutes they had carried for weeks. One woman held hers like a sacred relic, running her fingers across the fabric in disbelief. A British cook brought a kettle of tea, setting it on a crate without saying much. Tea was not something the women understood culturally. They stared at it as if it were a test. "Drink," the cook murmured. "It's warm. It's all that matters." It flowed into their hands, warming their palms, their chests, their belief about what an enemy was capable of. Still, even with kindness surrounding them, they remained cautious. Trauma does not evaporate with warmth. Fear does not vanish with blankets. But something had begun to shift, a quiet cracking in the walls they'd built around themselves. As dusk fell, a British corporal lit a lantern inside the tent. The glow painted soft, golden halos around the women's faces. They looked younger in the light, not enemy auxiliaries, not soldiers, not symbols, just people who had been caught in a machine much larger than themselves. They expected torture. Instead, they found a strange, fragile version of safety. They didn't know it yet. But the moment that would leave them weeping, truly weeping, was only hours away. Night settled slowly over the British camp, stretching long shadows across the orchard ruins. The German women POWs gathered near the stove, wrapped in blankets that still smelled faintly of British wool and wood smoke. Hunger gnawed at their stomachs, but it wasn't the physical emptiness that dominated their expressions. It was the silent battle between fear and curiosity. The first human angle to break through their defences came in the simplest form: food. A British mess corporal named Andrew Miller shuffled into the tent carrying a pot so large it seemed to swallow half the doorway. The rich scent of barley soup drifted behind him like a warm, invisible fog. To him, it was an ordinary meal, barely more than scraps stretched together, but to the women, it was an impossibility. When he ladled the soup into metal bowls, their reactions were immediate. A few stared as if the steam itself might burn them. One woman, pale and trembling, sniffed the broth with suspicion before her body betrayed her. She took a desperate, shaking sip, and then she froze. Her eyes filled so quickly it startled the others. Tears clung to her lashes, wobbling in the lantern light. She wasn't crying from the taste. She was crying because she couldn't understand why she was allowed to eat before punishment. Another woman, older, with thinning hair tucked behind her ears, looked at the bread placed beside the bowl. She held it delicately between her fingers, the way one might touch a relic, and whispered, "Wir sollen das nicht bekommen. We're not supposed to have this." The British soldiers didn't know what to say. To them, feeding prisoners was procedure. To these women, it felt like a violation of the laws of fear they had lived under for years. And with each bite, the story they'd been told about the enemy fractured a little more. If food softened their fear, what happened next struck even deeper. It came through kindness they had never expected and never believed possible from British soldiers. Late that night, the temperature dropped sharply, the kind of cold that crept under clothing and into bones. The German women tried to sleep on thin bedrolls laid across wooden planks, but the wind cut through the canvas walls. Some curled into themselves, shivering in silence. Others pressed their blankets against their faces to warm their breath. Private Lawrence Cole returned for his final rounds with a lantern and a small medical kit. He'd expected to treat a few minor complaints, bruises, blisters, exhaustion. He didn't expect the women to hide their injuries. When he knelt beside one woman whose ankle was visibly swollen, she recoiled so hard she hit the wood behind her. He froze. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said, voice low, steady. But she didn't believe him. Not yet. Her hands shook violently as he reached out. She kept whispering under her breath, "Bitte nicht! Bitte nicht! Please don't." Cole didn't touch her. Instead, he set the bandage down beside her and stepped back, giving her space. "You can do it yourself," he said softly. "Or I can help. Your choice." No German guard had ever offered a choice. Her eyes lifted slowly, searching his face for malice. She found none. Moments later, with trembling fingers, she extended her foot toward him, a decision made entirely of courage. The other women watched, stunned, as Cole wrapped her ankle with careful, almost brotherly gentleness. No anger, no punishment, no raised voice. That single act echoed across the tent. A quiet message, carried without words. You are no longer in the hands of cruelty. For the first time, some of them allowed themselves to breathe normally. Dawn crept over the British camp like a reluctant guest, brushing the sky with pale, exhausted light. Frost clung to the canvas tents, and the orchard trees shimmered as if encased in glass. A horn sounded in the distance. Morning roll call. Boots shuffled. Metal clanged. War, even in quiet hours, refused to sleep. Inside the women's tent, the German POWs stirred slowly, as though waking from a dream that hadn't yet decided whether it was merciful or cruel. Many hadn't slept at all. Fear had a way of surviving the night. Then came the sound that froze every breath. "Line up outside," a British corporal's voice, firm and unmistakable. The women's bodies reacted instantly, back straightening, hands trembling, eyes widening with the dread they had carried across collapsed front lines. This was it, they thought. The moment everything would change. The kindness they'd seen, food, blankets, gentle hands, must have been temporary. A trick, a calm before punishment. They gathered near the entrance, clutching the blankets around them as though they might serve as shields. One whispered, "Jetzt beginnt es." "Now it begins." Another quietly replied, "We knew it couldn't last." They stepped outside into the icy morning, their breath forming nervous clouds. British soldiers were lined up too, but their faces weren't hard or angry. They looked focused, tired, determined but not cruel. It only confused the women more. The corporal paced in front of them with a clipboard tucked under his arm. "We're doing a search," he announced. The words struck them like a blow. A search, a body search, humiliation, exposure. The thing every rumour, every warning, every whispered story had promised. Several women dropped their eyes to the dirt. One bit her lips so hard it bled. Another instinctively hugged her arms across her chest. The British soldiers exchanged glances, confused at the sudden wave of terror washing over the prisoners. Sergeant Hartley stepped forward. "It's a standard procedure," he explained gently. "No one will touch you. You'll remove your outer layers only. You will not be stripped." But the women didn't believe him. How could they? Back in Germany, they had heard stories, exaggerated, twisted, weaponized, about what happened when Allied soldiers captured women. Some believed they would be dragged into barns. Others expected their uniforms ripped from them. A few feared they might not survive at all. Hartley could see the panic spreading. Their shoulders shook. One woman, younger than the rest, barely 20, whispered, "Bitte, bitte nicht. Please, please don't." And that was the moment everything changed. Because the British soldiers, battle-hardened, sleep-deprived, carrying the weight of friends lost in trenches and fields, did something none of the women expected. They stepped back. Every last one of them. A full meter. Then, another. They turned their faces away respectfully, deliberately, leaving only the female ATS assistants to handle the inspection. To the women, the gesture was shattering. No rough grabbing, no shouting, no hands forcing them into vulnerability. Just space and respect. One ATS corporal, Margaret Ellis, a calm woman with steady eyes, approached and said, "We're only checking for weapons, radio parts or documents. Nothing else. You can keep your underclothes on. You are safe." Safe. The word landed like a foreign language. The women obeyed, but slowly, hesitantly, as though waiting for the trap to spring. Coats were removed, belts unbuckled, boots lifted. The British soldiers stood with their backs turned, faces toward the orchard, rifles slung but pointed to the ground. One woman began crying silently as she pulled off her overshirt. Not a cry of fear, but of relief. Another whispered through trembling lips, "Sie schauen nicht hin. They're not looking." A third, older than the others, covered her mouth as her chest began to heave with quiet sobs. She had prepared herself for humiliation. She had braced for violation. But what she received instead was dignity. One by one, the inspections ended. One by one, the British ATS women handed back coats, scarves, boots. One by one, German women realized the truth. The enemy wasn't here to break them. The enemy was treating them better than their own officers ever had. When the last woman finished, Sergeant Hartley turned back and said simply, "Thank you. You may return to your tent. Not prisoners, not women, just you." A word spoken to equals. Some of the POW women didn't move right away. Their legs were shaking too hard, their chests were tight. A few held onto each other like survivors of a storm. And then, as the British soldiers walked away, the women finally let themselves cry. Not from fear, but from the disorienting, overwhelming shock of kindness where they expected cruelty, from the shattering of everything they'd been told about their enemy, from the simple realization they were safe, truly safe. It was the moment that would remain in their diaries, their memories, their whispered stories for years after the war ended. It was the moment that left them weeping. The inspection changed something fundamental inside the camp, something invisible yet powerful, like the first crack in a wall that had stood for years. The German women returned to their tent, wrapped in blankets and a shock, moving not like prisoners, but like people who had survived a moment they'd been certain would break them. Some sat in silence, staring at their hands as though they no longer recognized them. Others wiped their faces again and again, as if clearing away the last remnants of fear. A few simply pressed their foreheads to their knees, overwhelmed by the idea that an enemy could show restraint greater than those they once called comrades. Word travelled fast. The entire camp had heard whispers by lunchtime. Sergeant Hartley refused to let the men watch. The ATS women handled everything. The prisoners cried, not from fear, but from relief. To the British soldiers, it was a small decision. To the German women, it was a revolution. But the moment that would define the day, the moment that would echo for decades, had not yet occurred. The gift. No one expected. That afternoon, Sergeant Hartley walked into the women's tent carrying a wooden crate. He set it on a table without saying a word, and gestured for the women to gather. They approached hesitantly, expecting documents, rations, or another round of questioning. Hartley reached inside the crate and lifted out something none of the women had seen in months. Shoes. Proper shoes. Strong leather, worn but intact. Laces that weren't broken. Soles that weren't torn apart by weeks of fleeing. The women stared as if he'd placed treasure before them. "These were collected from supply," Hartley explained. "You'll find your sizes inside." For a few seconds, no one spoke. Then one woman, the youngest, with braids now coming undone, reached out and touched a pair gently, almost reverently. She whispered, "Warham." "Why?" Not accusingly, but heartbreakingly confused. Hartley didn't try to deliver a speech. He didn't quote regulations. He simply said the words that would remain etched in their memories long after the war. "Because your feet are bleeding." Just that. Plain truth. Human truth. The girl's face crumpled. She pressed the shoes to her chest and sobbed quietly, shaking from the force of emotion she had held back for weeks. Another woman stepped forward. Then another. Soon the entire group stood around the crate, each selecting a pair with trembling fingers. Some kissed the leather. Others clutched the shoes as if afraid they might vanish. One woman, who had walked for 12 days with a makeshift sole stuffed with straw, sank to her knees. She didn't cry loudly. She simply folded over the shoes and whispered, "Danke, danke," over and over, like a prayer. When kindness breaks what fear built. Later that day, British medics invited the women to the wash area, not for forced bathing, not for delousing under threat, but for comfort. Warm water, soap, towels, tools of basic humanity that had become luxuries in the final year of the war. When the German women realized what was happening, their breaths caught in their throats. Some hesitated, unable to believe they were not being prepared for a degrading examination. But the ATS nurses reassured them, "No one will touch you. The water is yours." One woman stood before a basin, staring at the steam rising from the surface. Her hands hovered over it as if expecting pain. When she finally dipped her fingers in, her shoulders released a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. It wasn't the warmth that made her cry. It was permission. Permission to feel clean again, human again. Nearby, Private Cole knelt to adjust a heater under the tent. The same woman whose ankle he'd wrapped earlier approached him. She tried to speak, but the words tangled in her throat. Finally, she managed, "We were afraid you would hurt us." Cole looked at her with a soft, almost brotherly expression. "War hurts enough people," he said. "We don't need to add to the count." She covered her face with her hands and wept. Not from sorrow, but from the shock of hearing compassion in a place she expected cruelty. By evening, the women sat together in their tent, wearing their new shoes, warm clothes, and expressions softened by something more powerful than food or blankets. Dignity, safety, humanity rediscovered. They would later write in diaries that the British soldiers had not merely spared them. They had lifted them. They had shown the women something Germany had taken from them long before capture. The knowledge that even in war people can choose not to be monsters. And that realization, more than any command or regulation, is what left them truly, uncontrollably weeping. For the German women POWs, the hours following that extraordinary day felt unreal, like stepping out of a nightmare into a world whose rules they no longer understood. They sat together in their tent long after the sun fell, lantern light trembling across canvas walls, each woman quietly touching the new boots on her feet or the wool blanket wrapped around her shoulders as if checking that the kindness hadn't been imagined. Outside, the British camp settled into its usual rhythm. Soldiers cleaned rifles, officers reviewed maps under dim bulbs, a cook cursed at a dented kettle. It was an ordinary evening in the middle of an extraordinary war. But for the women, nothing was ordinary anymore. For the first time since surrendering, they felt something they had forgotten how to feel. Safe. Not just from bullets or artillery, but from the cruelty they had been taught to expect from the enemy. That sense of safety began to crack open something deeper. Memory. As night deepened, one woman, Anna Richter, a former radio assistant, pulled a small, battered notebook from inside her tunic. It had survived months of marching, retreating, and hiding. She flipped to a blank page, her hands trembling slightly. The others watched as she wrote slowly, deliberately, forming words that felt impossible to articulate aloud. They did not touch us. They stepped away. I cried more today than in all the last months. Not from fear, but from mercy? She stared at the last word for a long time, unsure whether she was allowed to believe it. Another woman, Martha Weiss, whispered into the quiet air, "Do you think they only did it today? Because someone was watching?" A British nurse passing by the tent flap overheard and leaned inside with a gentle smile. "No one was watching," she said softly. "It's just how we treat people." The statement stunned the women more than anything else that day, because that was the heart of it. Kindness wasn't a tactic. It wasn't for show. It wasn't to earn praise. It was simply human decency, something that had been drained from their world for far too long. A different kind of interrogation. The next morning, the women were escorted, not dragged, to a makeshift administrative tent. They expected harsh questioning, suspicion, cold glares. Instead, a British officer with round spectacles and ink-stained fingers invited them to sit. "Name, rank, assignment," he asked gently. No accusations, no shouting, no slurs. When one woman hesitated, he lowered his pen and said, "You're not on trial. We only need records." It was the first interrogation they'd ever experienced where the interrogator looked more exhausted than threatening. Some of the women even apologized before giving answers. It wasn't necessary. When the interview ended, the officer stood and bowed his head slightly. "Thank you for your cooperation. You'll be moved to a larger camp soon. Proper housing, medical care, and regular meals." Regular meals. The phrase alone felt like a miracle. As they stepped outside, a British private handed each of them a tin cup filled with warm tea. Not rationed, not earned, simply offered. One woman burst into tears immediately, unable to stop herself, not because she was weak, but because the simplest courtesies had become unimaginable luxuries in her world. A shift. The women didn't expect that afternoon. Several British soldiers were assigned to escort the women on a short walk through the orchard to stretch their legs. The guards stayed several paces behind, not looming over them, not gripping their rifles like threats. One soldier, a young man from Leeds, broke the silence with a nervous smile. "My mum would smack me if I treated anyone poorly," he said. A few women laughed, softly, cautiously, as though remembering what laughter used to feel like. Another soldier pointed to a tree with early blossoms struggling against the cold. "Spring's stubborn this year," he said, "but it always wins." The women exchanged glances, understanding the metaphor without needing translation. For the first time since captivity, they walked without fearing the sound of boots behind them. And in that simple walk among broken branches and melting frost, they began to understand. The war had not erased humanity. It had only hidden it, and here, on this foreign soil, they were seeing it return. The journey to the permanent POW camp began 2 days later. A line of British trucks rolled into the orchard, their engines rumbling softly under the grey morning sky. The women stood in a cluster, each wearing the boots they'd been given, each holding a tin cup or a folded blanket, like a piece of borrowed strength. A British officer approached with a clipboard. "Ladies," he said, "you'll be taken to a proper facility. Better shelter, better food, medical care." The word ladies stunned them. Never, not even in the German military, had they been addressed with such formality. When they climbed into the trucks, the British soldiers formed a path on either side, not as a show of dominance, but almost as an unspoken guard of honour. Their rifles pointed to the ground, their faces calm, their posture steady. No shouting, no pushing, only patience. One woman hesitated before stepping up, her body tight with memory. Sergeant Hartley offered a steadying hand. Not grabbing, not guiding, simply offering. It took her several seconds to accept it. When she finally did, she whispered something too soft to hear. Hartley didn't ask her to repeat it. Some gratitude exists only in the air between two people. Inside the trucks. As the convoy began moving, the women sat on wooden benches inside the canvas-covered back. The cold air slipped through the seams, but for the first time, none of them huddled in fear. They huddled simply because it was cold, and because the faint vibration of the truck felt strangely comforting. Anna, the woman with the diary, opened her notebook again. She wrote as the truck bounced along ruined roads. "I am confused by the British. I thought surrender meant shame. Shame meant punishment. But they treat us as if we are still human." Across from her, Marta stared out through a small tear in the canvas. She watched British soldiers marching alongside the trucks. Not as jailers, but as escorts. Their steps were steady, purposeful. She admired privately how they never seemed to treat their orders as opportunities for cruelty. She turned to the others and whispered, as if embarrassed by her own thought, "If our own officers had treated us half as well, perhaps we would not have run for so long." No one argued. Arrival at the main camp. The new camp looked nothing like the hellish images they had imagined. No cages, no chains, no pits or posts. Instead, rows of wooden barracks, smoke rising from chimneys, Red Cross flags fluttering in the wind. A nurse in a clean uniform checked a list, then smiled warmly at the approaching POWs. The women exchanged glances. How could the enemy greet them with more kindness than their own collapsing regime ever had? When they were led inside the barracks, another shock awaited them. Beds. Real beds, with straw mattresses, fresh straw, not mould, and wool blankets, folded neatly. One woman sat down and ran her hand across the fabric, tears welling again. "This is for us?" she asked, unable to fathom it. "For you," the nurse replied. "You'll be here until the war ends. You're safe now." Safe. That word kept returning, each time landing a little deeper. The letters home. A British corporal informed them they would be allowed to write letters home, 1 per month, censored but delivered. This was the moment that broke several of them completely. For months, they had believed their families might think them dead. They imagined mothers waiting for news, siblings searching lists, fathers fearing the worst. Now, with shaking hands, they dipped pens into ink and began writing words they never expected. "I am alive. I am being treated well. Do not fear for me." Some cried so hard they had to pause after every sentence. One woman, Helene, wrote something her own mind struggled to accept. "The British are not what we were told. They show mercy." She paused, staring at the words. Then slowly, she underlined mercy. The moment they would never forget that evening. As the women settled into their new beds, the British guards performed their routine checks. One guard, passing the window, saw one of the women holding her boots against her chest, not wearing them, just holding them, like a symbol of everything that had changed. He nodded to her through the window. No words, just a human acknowledgement. She lifted the boots slightly, as if showing him she hadn't forgotten who gave them. Later, when the lanterns were turned low, when the camp quieted to the soft murmur of distant engines and rustling blankets, the women finally allowed themselves to release the weight they had carried for too long. They cried again, silently, gently, but deeply, not from shame, not from fear, but from the overwhelming shock of discovering that their enemy had protected their dignity when their own nation had not. It was a truth they would carry into peace, a truth they would write in diaries, whisper to children, confess to historians. The British did not break us. They made us human again. War has a way of thinning the world into sharp edges. Uniforms, ranks, borders, orders. It asks men and women to forget softness, to forget nuance, to forget the quiet truth that an enemy is still a human being carrying their own weight of fear. For months, these German POW women moved through a world carved by that hardness. They expected every road to lead to punishment, every command to bring humiliation, every stranger to be another cruel lesson. But the British camp rewrote that script in ways no battlefield report ever recorded. They didn't meet monsters. They met tired young men who had seen enough suffering. They met medics who treated bruises instead of exploiting them. They met soldiers who stepped back when stepping forward would have deepened terror. They met a kind of strength that did not need to break anyone to prove itself. In their diaries, fragile paper survivors of a collapsing world, the women wrote about that morning of the inspection, the shoes, the warm water, the gentle hands. Not because these acts were extraordinary, but because in their lives they had become unimaginable. Years later, long after the war had ended and Europe began stitching itself, back together, those same women would speak of the British with a kind of quiet awe. They would say that the moment of mercy mattered more than victory or defeat, that dignity restored is more powerful than fear enforced, that the true measure of a soldier is not how he fights, but how he treats those who can no longer fight back. And perhaps that is the lesson history so often forgets to underline. Humanity does not vanish in war. It simply waits, quietly, stubbornly, for someone brave enough to choose it. On that cold morning in 1945, the British chose it. And in doing so, they gave 34 German women something they had not felt in far too long. The right to weep not from terror, but from the shock of being seen as human.